Okay, so when I say Ellis Island, what's the first thing that pops into your head? It's probably this picture, right? The Statue of Liberty right there, that huge, grand building, and ships just packed with people, all hoping to start a new life. For millions, this was the gateway to America. But that's not the whole story. Not even close.
What if that powerful image we all have of a welcoming golden door is just one piece of a much messier, more complicated puzzle? That's exactly what we're going to unpack right now.
So, first things first, we have to talk about the myth. The one that's practically etched into the American identity.
Yeah, the island of hope. The place that welcomed the tired, the poor, the huddled masses yearning to breathe free. It's a beautiful story, right? A one-way ticket to a fresh start. But the reality on the ground was, well, it was a little different from that romantic ideal.
And that first crack in the myth, it appears the moment you stepped onto the island, especially if you were a third-class passenger traveling in the cheapest conditions. You were immediately faced with a pretty daunting process they called the 6-second physical.
Now this is where it gets really interesting. They called it the medical gaze. And you'd think, okay, they're just checking for diseases. But nope. The real goal was to weed out undesirable people. And that didn't just mean someone who was contagious. It meant anyone who might wear out prematurely and become a burden instead of a source of cheap labor. It was an economic filter just as much as a medical one.
Just try to imagine what this felt like. You've just spent weeks on a crowded ship in steerage. You're exhausted, and then you're herded through these passageways that literally look like cattle pens. An officer gives you a quick once-over and slaps a chalk mark on your clothes if he suspects anything's wrong. And that eye exam for trachoma? They would flip your eyelids inside out with a finger or even a button hook. It must have been absolutely terrifying.
So what did those chalk marks actually mean? Well, this simple code was used to sort people. C could be an eye condition. S stood for senility. Basically, you were just considered too old. And an X? That meant the inspector suspected a mental defect, which would trigger a much more intense and often confusing exam. A single letter of chalk on your coat could decide your entire future.
But here's the real kicker. While very few people were actually sent back, we're talking less than 1%, look at why they were rejected. The vast majority, almost 70%, were turned away for having a poor physique, hernias, or just being too old. These weren't public health threats, they were conditions that made someone a less than perfect laborer. The system was basically filtering for workers.
Okay, now hold on, because this is where the story takes its biggest turn. That whole idea that everyone who came through Ellis Island was here to stay forever? Well, new research shows that's just flat out wrong.
For the longest time, historians figured the out-migration rate was maybe around 35%. The main story was permanent settlement. But recent analysis of the very same ship manifests reveals something huge. Migration was a massive two-way flow. So what was the real number?
76%, you heard that right. For the decade between 1900 and 1910, the rate of people who left compared to those who arrived was a stunning 76%. This wasn't a one-way street, it was a revolving door. For so many people, America was a place to work, save some money, and then go home.
So how could the official story be so wrong for so long? Well, it was a few things. You had careless data collection, officials who didn't even bother to count first and second-class passengers, and a definition of immigrant that kept changing. All of it led to incredibly inconsistent records. And this chart just drives that point home. For the next decade, from 1910 to 1920, the problem got even worse. The actual number of immigrants who came to the U.S. was a whopping 170% higher than what the official stats showed. We're talking about millions of arrivals and departures that were just never counted.
But there's one more chapter to the Ellis Island story, and it's a dark one that's often forgotten. It's about a time when the island transformed from a gateway into a prison.
Just look at this timeline. For almost 50 years, Ellis Island is an immigration station. But in 1941, when World War II breaks out, its purpose changes completely. The gateway becomes a detention facility.
Right after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the FBI used pre-war surveillance lists to round up Japanese, German, and Italian nationals living in the New York area. They were labeled enemy aliens, taken to Ellis Island and imprisoned there, in the very same buildings where so many had once arrived looking for freedom.
This quote from Noe Suzuki, who was detained on the island, is just heartbreaking. Here's a man who wants to be a loyal American, but he's being imprisoned by America. It captures the awful irony felt by so many who were held on an island that was supposed to represent the exact opposite of what it had become for them.
So what do we do with all this? With this much more complicated history? How do we make sense of an icon that holds so many contradictory truths all at once?
You know, maybe the best way to understand Ellis Island is to see that it wasn't just one thing. It had at least 4 different faces. It was the gateway of hope, that powerful myth we all know. But it was also a filter of desirability, designed to pick out a certain kind of worker. It was a revolving door for a global labor force, not a permanent home for everyone. And, for a dark time, it was a prison of fear.
In the end, the full story of Ellis Island isn't just about the past. It's a mirror that reflects America's shifting, often conflicting attitudes about who is welcome, who is desirable, and who belongs. The island is now a museum, but its complicated legacy leaves us with a really important question to think about. What stories are our borders telling today?